Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing something that's just a little bit different. It's just me and we're out here on the ice, and I'm going to share with you a few baits that I've been using a little bit more this year. And I'm going to break down some of the reasons why I tend to be favoring these baits, at least how this season has gone so far. I have an underwater camera, got the baits right here on the ground, and without further ado, let's jump right in. So I think we're actually going to start with a little bit more of a walleye specific emphasis, and the first bait we're going to talk about is like the old tried and true trusty, all of you probably have this in your tackle box, and it is the Buckshot Spoon. And the reason why we're talking about the Buckshot Spoon today is not because it's like this new fancy bait that none of you have ever heard about, probably the exact opposite, but the reason why is because earlier this year, it was actually basically through the month of December, I did this series where I fished on ice for 30 days in a row, and I put out a video every single time. And the Buckshot Spoon, specifically when I was chasing walleyes, was my most used spoon. And the reason for that is because when you're putting out 30 videos a day, you're basically trying your hardest to catch fish every single day. And if there's one thing that I have the most confidence in, it's the little finessey yet loud Buckshot Spoon. And the reason why, it can catch fish in all kinds of environments, and when they're in a good aggressive mood, you can use rattles to call them in. I'll actually drop the bait down right now and kind of show you how I work it. It's really good when the fish are in an active mood because it has those loud rattles and you can pound it on the bottom. I actually fish it more like this, I pound it. A lot of people will just kind of steadily rock it in place, and that might be okay when you're not paying attention, but when you are actively trying to catch fish and attract fish to your hole, more of a pounding action is a lot better because you're going to activate those rattles, you're going to create a lot more noise, and then of course, like when you do see those fish on your screen, you can slow down your presentation a little bit and entice the bite. But that's the other part about why this bait is so awesome, because you know, you can create a lot of noise with it if you want, but also when the bite is a little bit tougher, it has a nice slim profile that the fish really like, and you know, obviously you're gonna put a minnow head or some worms on the bottom of it. And this has just been one of my go-to baits because I can just consistently catch fish on it just about anywhere. I love the fire tiger color, or greens or oranges, especially when I'm fishing in lakes that have perch in them. Most of the lakes that I fish in do have perch, so that tends to be a go-to color for me. And like I said, this bait has been great for me for walleyes. It's a little windy outside, but it's also excellent for crappies in my experience as well. So I've been using it for crappies a little bit too. So when I needed a tried and true weapon of choice, that's what I've been using this year. Now, a bait that looks really similar to the Buckshot Spoon, but is just like totally different, in my opinion, is the forage minnow spoon. And the reason why I've been leaning on this bait a little bit more this year is because once you get into that mid-season period, there's not a lot of tools that are better for enticing walleye strikes, just because this is just a lot more of a finessey presentation than the trusty Buckshot Spoon. This is a louder bait, and yes, you can get those finessey bites, and it can be great during the midwinter period, but something that's even better is something that has a slimmer profile and does not have rattles. So when you drop this thing down, this is about as finessey as it gets, and I'll drop it in this hole right here that's nice and close to the camera because it's a smaller profile. There she is. As you can see, this is just like a really thin, finessey profile, and this is key when the fish are being a little bit more tight-lipped. Now what I'll do with this bait is I'll fish it somewhat similar to how I fish the buckshot, but just a lot more finessey because it doesn't have those rattles. You don't need to be ripping it all over the place. What I like to do is kind of just pick it up and drop it, let it fall down, and it actually falls a little bit differently when you have a little minnow head on the bottom. But I'll also kind of shake it down in the mud as well, just kind of give it a subtle shake, and sometimes that can do the trick as well. But during that midwinter period, the walleyes are really tight to the bottom, and they're not as willing to chase, and if you're being aggressive, you could scare the fish off. That's where silence and a thin profile and more of like a mellow jig and retrieve can really take the cake. Now along the same lines, another more finessey spoon style bait that I'm really liking is the forage minnow jig. Now the last bait that we talked about was the forage minnow spoon. This one is the jig. And what's cool about the jig option is the fact that it also does not have rattles. It also has a really thin profile. But in addition to that, it does not have a treble hook dangling from the bottom. It just has this single hook right here. And the reason why the single hook is awesome is because it's a different look that's even a little bit more finessey, and it has a really good hookup ratio when you put a minnow on it as well. So one way that I like to use this bait is on dead sticks, and I will basically just take this hook and thread it through the back of like a small minnow, or you could even put it on a shiner or anything like that, and just let that minnow do the work, swimming around and enticing the fish. And that's one way I love to fish this bait. Another way I like to fish it is I'll just take a small minnow and I'll tail hook it, and then I'll just actively jig this bait. And I'm not jigging it a ton, I'm just kind of lifting it up and then letting it drop back down, not even on a slack line, on a tight line, kind of controlling the fall speed of this bait. And that's when it seems like you're gonna call fish in from a distance, is pulling it up a little bit higher where they can see it. And then it's more of a visual thing with this particular bait. You know, you're gonna move some water because as you're pulling that minnow upwards, it's kind of pushing water out, but more importantly, the fish are gonna see it. And then oftentimes what I'm doing when I'm marking a fish is just kind of pulling that bait slowly upward and letting that fish kind of chase it and eventually commit. And if they don't fall for that, what's cool about this bait is if you drop it down on the bottom, it's gonna land hook up just about every time, because just the way that this particular jig is weighted, there's more weight on this side, so the hook is gonna be hook up. So this is a great bait if you're fishing directly on the bottom. You can lay this jig on the bottom with a minnow on it, kicking around, kicking up dirt, kicking up mud, and the fish will come and slurp it off the bottom with a good hooking percentage, because that hook point is right there going right into its lip. So this is a bait that I've been using kind of all season. When I went to North Dakota, I caught some fish on it when the bite was a little bit tougher and I wasn't able to move because we weren't able to take machines out there to go track down active schools of fish. So setting up camp in the hub house, trying to keep the cameras warm, and a finessey option like this really paid off. This particular color I think is great because it mimics minnows really well. It's got the blue, it's got the purple, and then kind of, you know, silvery with white on the back. To me, this has been one of my go-to colors in pretty much all situations, especially when I'm up in the weeds and I know there's a lot of minnows around. So this has been a good one for me. Now changing gears, we just talked about a couple finessey baits. On the exact opposite of the spectrum, we have the puppet minnow. And once again, the puppet minnow is not a new bait, but it's a really good option for catching aggressive fish. And early ice, like, this is what I'm using like over 50% of the time probably, especially when I'm kind of in search mode. You can fish it deep, you can fish it shallow. In both those situations, you can fish it really efficiently just because of how quickly it falls. And it's great in clear water situations because, actually let me put it on the rod quick so you can take a look at it underwater. It's great in clear water situations because visually the fish can see it from really far away. And last year I used the rattling puppet minnow quite a bit, and I think that's a good option. But sometimes not having the rattles is a nice benefit too. And the reason for that is in shallow water, sometimes in clear water, sometimes the rattles can be a little bit too much. And dirtier water situations, they work well. But look right there, we got a tiny little bluegill, which is not exactly what I use this bait for. But anyway, I guess what I was getting at is the fact that in clear water situations, these fish can see it from a long distance away, and when it jumps out to the side, it's kind of flashing left, flashing right, and it calls fish in. And then once you do finally mark a fish, you can slow it down a little bit. I may even still pop it a couple times like this, because sometimes that can be sort of a triggering aspect just to keep those fish fired up, specifically with walleyes. But when crappies come in, I like to slow it down a lot more, because then they can kind of like narrow down on it and bite it, as opposed to try to chase it down. Crappies are not quite as good at that, in my opinion, when you're going left and right and all over the place. Versus walleyes will come in and, you know, they'll move a lot of water as they're opening their mouth and sucking in. So that's kind of my thought process with it. But this has been one of my go-to baits. I do like bright colors just because they tend to work well in kind of like that moderate clarity water, but they also work really good in a lot of clear water systems too, like pink and chartreuse and all that works really good on Mille Lacs Lake. So that is another bait that I've been using like quite a lot this winter. Next up, I want to talk just for a moment about the Buckshot Coffin Spoon. This is actually a newer bait, and I've been using this one quite a bit as well. And in particular, I've liked it during the early season just because it has a little bit more of a bigger profile. It has those rattles just like the Buckshot Spoon, but it's also just got more action overall. Let's get it down here. It has like a little bit of a flutter and shimmy as it drops. It drops pretty quickly, so you can pound the bottom with it. And it's got a big profile, and it sort of flips over a little bit as you're jigging it. I don't know how well you're gonna be able to see it in this particular video here, but yeah, you can see it pretty decent. It kind of tumbles a little bit, and it's just a little bit, it's just an action that's a little bit different than you see in a lot of the spoons in the Northland lineup. And that's the reason I've been using it a little bit more. I think this is a good bait for pounding the bottom, which is definitely an application that can be effective with bringing walleyes into your hole. I'm gonna move this camera a little bit. It got a little off-centered. Okay. So, I don't think I need to go super deep on this, but this is just another spoon that I've been using a lot, and it's kind of nice because you can fish it real aggressively like the Buckshot, and probably call fish in from even further than what that bait will do. And the reason for that is it just has that bigger profile. It kind of has like just a different coffin shaped profile, which to me moves more water. It's got that kicker tail down underneath, which is also a really cool feature. So this is a bait that I'm starting to use more, specifically on early ice, and I know that I'm going to be using it a ton on late ice as well. So that's just been one of my go-tos, and I guess specifically for walleyes, I've been liking it a lot. All right, looking at the panfish side of things. Got my panfish rod right here, and as you can see, I got a little jig. So I got a couple jigs that I've been using a lot more than just about anything else in my whole panfish lineup. And I did talk a little bit how I use some of the Buckshot Spoon, forage minnow spoon, how I will use actually every single bait that I've talked about so far I will use for panfish sometimes, specifically crappies. With bluegills I tend to go jig or bust. But anyway, I guess what I was getting at is a couple panfish baits, panfish specific baits that I've been using a lot. And one thing that I noticed when I was fishing 30 days in a row on first ice was that, man, seems like I'm using this little fly jig offering pretty much more than just about anything else. And this is the tungsten punch fly. And basically what we got here is just like a little fly jig with a tungsten head. And they have a lot of sweet colors. I love this orange and green color. I love the white color. I love pink. I love chartreuse. They got a lot of good options. But as I drop it down here, what's great about having a tungsten jig is the fact that it punches through slush really well. I definitely did not do a good job of cleaning up the slush in my hole, so let's get this thing down so you can take a closer look at it. There it is. And it looks like my camera rotated a little bit. That's kind of been a little bit of a pain in the butt I've been noticing with the camera this year. Must have some like line twist or something. But anyway, as you look at this bait, oh, we got a bluegill down there right now. Super tiny one. Anyway, just like that, you can see it's coming in and biting it. And what's great about this bait is the fact that I don't have any meat on it. If you just drop like a normal tungsten jig down there, you're not gonna get like a ton of bites from fish. And as you can see, that one was super tiny, but it came up and took a peck at it. And the reason why is because it has that hair on it. That's why I love fishing baits that have hair, and that's the reason why I've been fishing them a ton so far this season, and probably more than any other season so far, is just the fact that looks like there's a fish coming in the background there. If you do end up losing your bait, like let's say a fish comes in and takes a bite, and I set the hook and the worms fly off, or you know, they pull the worms off. Is that the same guy? It might be. You can still catch fish with this bait even if there's no worms on it. So that's why I really like it. It has a really good hook. Ooh, man, apparently I'm hanging out in the nursery here. So anyway, I'm gonna pull it up right now. But anyway, that's what's cool about this bait. The fact that it's tungsten, the fact that it has a great hook for good hooking percentage. Those are all reasons why I love this particular bait. And lastly, I think this is the last bait we're gonna talk about, is the tungsten gill getter. And this is actually a newer bait. I think it came out this past year, and the reason why I love this bait is the fact that it has a super thin finesse profile. So kind of the fly jig I will use in like all kinds of situations, whether I'm being more finesse or I want to be a little bit more active. But when I'm using this tiny little tungsten gill getter is when I need something that's going to be really, really finessey, because it has that thin profile. It's very dense with that tungsten weight, so it can get down in a hurry. You can punch through slush, but just how thin it is. If you look how thin it is, it's crazy. The mud bug is another really good option, but it's a totally different thing. This thin profile is great because I think, you know, especially when you have like a thin, slender plastic coming off the back of it, you just have a good, slender profile that the fish are gonna be a little bit more likely to bite when they're not in a great mood. But also, the top of this bait is nice and flat as well, the top and the bottom. But specifically the top is important because it's really good when you're fishing in deeper water situations or you're fishing down in the weeds. It makes it a lot easier to see it on your sonar. So that's one of the big pluses to this bait, and one of the main reasons why I'm using it, in addition to that just really slender profile that I think gets more bites. So yeah, I feel like I've rambled on enough. Those are a few baits that I've just been using more often than not this year, and actually just more this year than in years past. So hopefully you got some value from this, and you can kind of understand why I'm using some of the baits that I have been using this year. So if you enjoyed this video and you found any of it valuable, if you learned anything, hit that little red subscribe button down below, because we have more content coming in the months ahead. I want to thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.